Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. Tom Carter had always been fascinated by the unknown. Growing up in the small farming town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, he'd often find himself lying in the endless cornfields behind his family's farmhouse, staring up at the vast night sky. The stars seemed close enough to touch in that rural darkness, unmarred by city lights or pollution. His mother would call him in for dinner, her voice carrying across the rustling cornstalks, but young Tom would linger just a few minutes longer, watching the moon rise over the horizon like a pale sentinel keeping watch over the sleeping world. He'd trace the lunar craters with his finger, naming them from the astronomy books he'd checked out from the town library. Mare Tranquillitatis, Tycho, Copernicus. Each name carried the weight of human discovery, of minds that had reached across the void to touch something beyond Earth's embrace. Even then, at 12 years old, Tom knew that the moon held secrets. He could feel it in the way the ancient light played across his upturned face, in the way the shadows seemed to shift and dance in the Lunar Maria. His father, a practical man who worked the corn and soybean fields that stretched to every horizon, would shake his head at his son's obsession. "That boy's got his head in the clouds," he'd tell Tom's mother over coffee and the morning farm report. "Needs to keep his feet on the ground like the rest of us." But Tom's mother understood. She'd been a teacher before she married, before the demands of farm life consumed her days. She'd seen the hunger for knowledge in her son's eyes, the same hunger that had driven her to earn a degree in literature, despite growing up in a time when few farm girls were expected to go to college. She nurtured Tom's curiosity, driving him to the county library every Saturday, helping him build model rockets in their barn, encouraging him to apply for the state science fair year after year. By the time Tom graduated high school as valedictorian, his path was clear. MIT accepted him on a full academic scholarship, and 4 years later he emerged with a degree in aerospace engineering and dreams of touching the stars that had captivated him since childhood. NASA hired him straight out of college in 2001, placing him in the mission planning division at Johnson Space Center. For 22 years, he'd worked on everything from Mars rover missions to deep space probes, always hoping that someday he'd be part of a mission that would return humans to the moon. The Artemis program had rekindled that hope, but budget constraints and political pressures had pushed the timeline further and further into the future. Now, in October of 2023, Tom found himself working late in his cluttered office, surrounded by the detritus of 2 decades in government service. Coffee-stained reports, obsolete computer manuals, and photographs of successful launches covered every available surface. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, with their characteristic 60-cycle buzz, casting harsh shadows across the institutional grey walls. He was reviewing old mission documentation as part of a routine archive digitization project, mindless work that had been dragging on for months. The building was nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional security guard. Making his rounds and the distant hum of computers, processing data through the night. Tom had volunteered for the late shift to avoid the daytime chaos of meetings and phone calls, preferring the solitude that allowed him to focus on the detailed work of preserving NASA's history. He was about to pack up and head home to his empty apartment, divorce papers signed just 6 months earlier, citing irreconcilable differences that boiled down to his obsession with work and her need for a husband who came home for dinner, when his fingers brushed against something unexpected, wedged behind one of the filing cabinets, almost as if someone had deliberately hidden it there decades ago. was a manila folder that clearly didn't belong with the Apollo mission reports he'd been cataloguing. The folder was old, far older than anything else in this particular archive. The paper had yellowed with age, the edges brittle and crumbling at his touch. Tom pulled it free carefully, noting how it had been compressed into the narrow gap between the cabinet and the wall. Someone had definitely hidden this, and they'd done it well enough that it had remained undiscovered for what looked like decades. The file was labelled Lunar Mission X-74 in faded typewriter text, the kind produced by the IBM Selectrix that NASA had used in the 1970s. Tom frowned as he examined the cover. There was no record of any X-74 mission in NASA's public documentation, and the designation didn't match any naming convention he was familiar with. Apollo missions were numbered sequentially, and the numbering had stopped at Apollo 17 in 1972. What could X-74 possibly refer to? The classification stamps on the folder were unlike anything Tom had seen in his 22 years with the agency. Instead of the familiar secret or top secret markings, this file bore stamps reading above top secret, cosmic clearance only, and Project Lunar Shield, no foreign dissemination. Tom's hands began to tremble as he opened the folder. Inside were documents that made his breath catch in his throat. Handwritten mission logs on official NASA letterhead, official memos with signatures he didn't recognize, and a collection of photographs that defied everything he thought he knew about the history of lunar exploration. The mission logs were written in 3 distinct hands, each entry signed with names that weren't in any official NASA astronaut roster: Commander Robert Hayes, Pilot Alan Foster, and Mission Specialist John Wiles. The handwriting was steady at first, professional and matter-of-fact, but as Tom read through the entries, he could see the penmanship becoming increasingly erratic, as if the writers had been under growing stress. The first entry was dated March 12, 1974. Lunar Mission X-74, Day 1. Successful launch from Kennedy Space Center at 3:47 a.m. All systems nominal during translunar injection burn. Crew morale high. Mission parameters remain classified per Director Hayes' direct orders. Landing site designated as Aitken Basin, far side coordinates 16.2 degrees south, 173.1 degrees east. Expected lunar insertion in 72 hours. Tom's heart began to race. March 1974 was nearly 2 years after Apollo 17, which was supposed to be the final lunar mission. According to every history book, every NASA document, every public record, no human had set foot on the moon between December 1972 and the present day. Yet, here was evidence of a mission that had not only launched, but had successfully reached the moon. The second entry, dated March 15th, described their landing: Lunar Mission X-74, Day 4. Successful powered descent and landing at Aitken Basin primary site. Location is unlike anything we trained for. The basin is deeper than orbital photography suggested, with unusual geological formations that don't match pre-mission surveys. Crew health nominal, all systems functioning within normal parameters. Beginning EVA operations at 2 p.m. local mission time. Tom flipped through more pages, his excitement growing with each entry. This was the discovery of a lifetime. Proof of a secret NASA mission that had somehow been erased from history. But as he continued reading, his excitement began to curdle into something else entirely. The entries for days 5 and 6 described routine surface operations, sample collection, photographic surveys, deployment of scientific equipment. But, starting with day 7, the tone began to change dramatically. The handwriting became less steady and the content took on an increasingly urgent quality. Lunar Mission X-74, Day 7. Something's wrong with our communication equipment. We're receiving massive interference on all frequencies, unlike anything we encountered during Apollo missions. Mission control responses are increasingly garbled. Foster believes it's solar activity, but the interference has a pattern to it, almost like it's structured. Hayes has ordered a complete communications equipment check. The next entry was even more disturbing. Lunar Mission X-74, Day 8. Communication problems persist and are worsening. But that's not the strangest part. We've discovered geological formations that aren't on any of our survey maps. Large metallic structures emerging from the crater floor, approximately 2 kilometers from our landing site. They appear to be artificial, but that's impossible. Hayes has authorized investigation. Tom's mouth went dry as he read the next entry. Lunar Mission X-74, Day 9. The structures are definitely artificial. No natural process could create formations with such perfect geometric symmetry. They appear to be constructed from materials unknown to terrestrial science. Spectroscopic analysis returns impossible readings. The instruments seem unable to process whatever these things are made of. Hayes is preparing for close approach investigation, despite Foster's objections. By day 10, the handwriting had become barely legible. We shouldn't have come here. The structures are bigger than we thought. They extend deep underground, maybe kilometers down into the lunar crust. And they're not dead. They pulse with their own light, and when we get close, our equipment starts acting strange. Not just malfunctioning, acting like it's being controlled by something else. The final entry that Tom could make out was dated day 11. We've found something we can't explain. It's watching us. We're staying here for the night, but we don't know what it is. Foster thinks we should return to the lander immediately, but Hayes wants to investigate further. I've never seen anything like this in all my years of training. Whatever it is, it doesn't belong here. But then again, maybe we're the ones who don't belong. The entry was signed by John Wiles, and his handwriting had become so erratic that Tom could barely make out the signature. Tom leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What had they discovered out there in the Aitken Basin? And why had this mission been erased from all official records? Before he could fully process the implications of what he was reading, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside his office. Tom quickly closed the folder and slipped it into his desk drawer. But he needn't have bothered being secretive. The footsteps belonged to Mark Davis, one of his colleagues from the Planetary Science Division. Mark appeared in the doorway holding a thick stack of files and wearing an expression that Tom had never seen before, a mixture of excitement and genuine terror. "Tom," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was hoping you'd still be here. You need to see what I found." Mark had been working in the basement archives all week, going through boxes of materials that had been scheduled for destruction but somehow overlooked for decades. What he'd found made Tom's discovery look like just the tip of an iceberg that stretched far deeper into NASA's classified past than either of them had ever imagined. "I've been going through the condemned files," Mark explained as he sat down and carefully arranged his materials on Tom's desk. Stuff that was supposed to be incinerated in the 1980s but got misfiled and forgotten. When I saw your light was still on, I figured you might be the only person crazy enough to look at this stuff with me. The files Mark had brought were even older than Tom's X-74 folder, some dating back to the early 1970s. The classification levels were beyond anything either of them had ever seen. Designations like Majestic Clearance and Eyes Only, Director Level, stamped in red ink across manila folders that had been sealed with wax and wire. "Mark, where exactly did you find these?" Tom asked, examining the security seals. "Locked in a filing cabinet that wasn't supposed to exist, buried behind 40 years of routine paperwork in storage room B7. The cabinet wasn't on any inventory list, and it took me 3 hours with a crowbar to get it open." Tom opened the first file with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The images were grainy black and white prints, clearly taken with the primitive camera equipment available to astronauts in the 1970s. They had the characteristic look of Hasselblad photographs, the same cameras used during the Apollo missions. The first few shots appeared routine, 3 crew members in bulky white spacesuits, standing beside a lunar lander that Tom didn't recognize. It was larger than the Apollo lunar modules, with a more sophisticated design that suggested extended surface operations capability. The lunar landscape in the background was stark and airless, with the characteristic sharp shadows created by unfiltered sunlight. The Earth hung in the black sky above them like a blue marble, impossibly distant and fragile. So far, everything looked like standard mission documentation. But as Tom turned through the photographs, his breath caught in his throat. In the background of the 5th photograph, barely visible in the deep shadows of what had to be the Aitken Basin, was something that absolutely should not have been there. It was a structure, massive, geometrically perfect, and utterly alien. The object rose from the crater floor like a spire, its surface smooth and reflective in a way that no natural lunar formation could ever be. Tom estimated its height at several hundred meters, making it taller than most skyscrapers. The material it was constructed from seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, creating an optical effect that made Tom's eyes water when he tried to focus on the details. The structure's base disappeared into the lunar regolith, suggesting that what was visible might be only a small portion of a much larger complex. Strange patterns covered its surface, not random, but clearly designed according to some alien aesthetic that human minds weren't equipped to fully comprehend. "What is this?" Tom whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Mark was silent, staring at the images with the same mixture of fascination and terror that Tom felt. "Keep looking," he said quietly. "It gets much worse." The next series of photographs showed the astronauts moving closer to the alien structure, but something deeply unsettling was happening to the images themselves. The closer the crew got to the spire, the more the photographs seemed to warp and distort, as if the camera's film was somehow unable to properly record what it was seeing. In one particularly disturbing image, taken from perhaps 50 meters away from the structure, the astronauts appeared almost ghost-like. Their forms bled into the surrounding landscape like double-exposed phantoms, their spacesuits seeming to become transparent at the edges. The structure itself pulsed with its own internal light, creating strange interference patterns across the photographic emulsion that reminded Tom of the aurora borealis. "The equipment started malfunctioning," Tom muttered, remembering what he'd read in the mission logs. "They tried to get closer, but their instruments went haywire." But it was the next photograph that made Tom's blood turn to ice. This image was taken from further back, showing the 3 astronauts standing in a rough line about 30 meters from the base of the alien spire. But behind them, barely visible in the shadow cast by the structure, were additional shapes. These shapes were not part of the alien architecture. They moved. Tom squinted at the photograph, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The shapes were dark and fluid, seeming to flow across the lunar surface like liquid mercury, but with a purposefulness that suggested intelligence. They had no clearly defined edges or boundaries. They seemed to exist in a state somewhere between solid matter and pure energy. "Those aren't rock formations," Tom said, his voice barely audible. "Those are living beings." Mark nodded grimly, and they were aware of the human presence. "Look at the next one." The following photograph showed the same scene from a slightly different angle, but now the fluid shapes had moved. They were closer to the astronauts, and their arrangement suggested they were deliberately surrounding the human visitors. The largest of the entities appeared to be nearly 10 meters long, its form rippling with internal patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some unknown heartbeat. Tom set the photographs aside with shaking hands. The implications were staggering. Not only had NASA conducted a secret lunar mission in 1974, but that mission had made contact with alien life forms of clearly advanced intelligence. "There's more," Mark said, producing another folder. "Video logs." Tom's computer was equipped with an old magnetic tape drive, a relic from the days when NASA's budget was too tight to upgrade all equipment simultaneously. Mark inserted the first tape with careful precision, and they both held their breath as the ancient mechanism whirred to life. The footage that appeared on the screen was grainy and filled with static, but it was clearly authentic. The timestamp in the corner read March 19th, 1974, 2:45 p.m, and the camera was positioned inside the lunar lander, looking out through one of the small triangular portholes. The image showed John Wiles standing outside the lander in his bulky white spacesuit. Even through the poor quality of the recording and the distortion caused by filming through the thick porthole glass, Tom could see that something was terribly wrong. Wiles was moving erratically, constantly looking over his shoulder, as if he expected something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. His movements had the jerky, panicked quality of someone barely maintaining control of their fear. When Wiles spoke, his voice came through the lander's communication system, crackling with static and distorted by emotion. "Mission Control, this is Lunar X-74. We have a situation up here. The interference with our communications is getting worse, but that's not the main problem anymore. There's something out here with us. Something that doesn't want us here." The transmission cut to static for several seconds. When it resumed, Wiles had moved closer to the camera, and Tom could see the fear in his eyes even through the helmet's golden visor. "Whatever is out here, it's not like anything we've ever encountered in our training simulations. It's not following any natural laws, we understand. The structure we found, it's not just a building or an artifact. It's alive somehow. It responds to our presence. When we get close, it changes." In the background, Tom could hear other voices. Hayes and Foster arguing about something in heated whispers that the microphone couldn't quite pick up. The tension in their voices was unmistakable, even filtered through decades-old recording equipment. Then Wiles was speaking directly into the camera again, and the terror in his voice was unmistakable. "We tried to take samples from the structure's base. The moment our drilling equipment made contact, the whole thing started to vibrate. Not just vibrating like a machine, singing, making sounds that no human throat could produce, sounds that seemed to come from inside our heads rather than through the thin lunar atmosphere." The camera suddenly lurched as someone bumped into it, and for a moment the image showed the interior of the lander. Tom could see emergency lights flashing, equipment scattered across the floor, and the faces of three men who had encountered something that had shaken them to their very core. Hayes looked haggard, his usually neat appearance disheveled. Foster was bent over a control panel, frantically adjusting dials and switches. The confined space of the lander felt claustrophobic even through the video feed. When the image stabilized again, Wiles was staring directly into the camera, his face pale and drawn beneath his helmet's visor. "If anyone finds this recording, you need to understand what we've discovered here. We made contact. Not with the structure itself, but with what lives inside it. They're still out there watching us from places we can't see. We can feel them in our minds when we get too close to their territory. They're not hostile exactly, but they're protective. They don't want us to leave, but they also don't want us to stay. It's like they're trying to decide what to do with us." A new voice joined the conversation, Commander Hayes, though he was off camera. "Wiles, shut down that recording. We don't know who might be monitoring our transmissions." "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think anyone on Earth is listening anymore. I think they're jamming our communications specifically to prevent Mission Control from learning about this place. They want to study us in isolation." The image went black for several seconds, then returned showing the exterior of the lander through the porthole. In the distance, the alien structure was clearly visible, and Tom gasped as he realized it was now glowing with its own internal light, a soft, pulsing radiance that seemed to breathe like a living thing. The light pulsed in complex patterns, and Tom found himself becoming hypnotized by the rhythm, until Mark shook his shoulder. "Keep watching," Mark said. This is where it gets really bad. The final segment of the recording showed the lunar landscape at what appeared to be local sunset, though the sun never truly set on the lunar far side. It was more like the slow rotation of the moon was carrying their landing site into the permanent shadow of the crater rim. As the harsh sunlight faded, the alien structure's bioluminescence became more pronounced, casting eerie patterns of light across the surrounding terrain. But it was what emerged from that structure that made Tom's blood freeze in his veins. Figures began moving across the lunar surface, tall, graceful forms that seemed to glide rather than walk. Even through the poor quality of the recording, it was clear that these beings were not human. They moved with fluid precision, their forms seeming to shift and flow as they approached the human landing site. Then came Wiles's final transmission, his voice now filled with absolute terror. They're coming out of the structure now. Multiple contacts moving fast across the surface toward our position. They don't look like anything in our xenobiology training manuals. God help us, they're beautiful and horrible at the same time. We're sealing the lander, but I don't think it's going to matter. They're not trying to break in. They're trying to communicate, and I think they're succeeding. The transmission ended abruptly, cutting to black static that filled Tom's office with white noise. Tom stared at the blank monitor, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The silence in his office was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system and the soft tick of the institutional wall clock. "There's more," Mark said quietly, and Tom noticed for the first time that his colleague's hands were shaking as badly as his own. Official documentation, memos from the highest levels of NASA administration. Mark produced another file, this one containing official NASA memoranda with classification stamps that Tom had never seen before. The letterhead read, "Office of the Director, Cosmic Clearance Only," and was signed by someone named Director Hayes, presumably the same Hayes who had commanded the X-74 mission. Tom read the memo aloud, his voice growing quieter with each word. "To all personnel involved with Lunar Mission X-74, the alien structures discovered at the Aitken Basin site must remain undisturbed indefinitely. Under no circumstances can information about this discovery be allowed to reach the public, the scientific community, or any foreign government. The crew's reports indicate first contact with intelligence of unknown origin and clearly advanced capability." The memo continued, "All mission records are to be classified at the highest levels and removed from standard archives immediately. The families of the crew are to be informed that their loved ones died in a training accident during a routine simulation exercise. Official cause of death, catastrophic failure of environmental life support systems during EVA training at Johnson Space Center." Tom's hands trembled as he read the final paragraph. This is not merely a matter of national security. It is a matter of species survival. Based on the crew's final transmissions, we are dealing with intelligences that possess capabilities far exceeding our current understanding of physics, biology, and technology. The site is to be designated permanently off-limits to all future lunar missions, and contingency plans are to be developed for dealing with potential alien contact on Earth. The memo is dated March 25, 1974, just 6 days after the final transmission from the X-74 crew. "They covered it up," Tom said, his voice hollow with shock. "Whatever happened to those astronauts, NASA buried it so completely that it's taken nearly 50 years for anyone to find even traces of it." Mark nodded grimly. "But that's not the worst part, Tom. Keep reading." The next document in the file was a follow-up report dated 6 months later, and it revealed the true scope of what NASA had been hiding from the world. According to this classified report, the astronauts hadn't just discovered a single alien structure, they had found evidence of an entire underground civilization. Analysis of the final transmissions and photographic evidence had revealed that the visible spire was merely the uppermost portion of a vast complex that extended for kilometers beneath the Aitken Basin. The alien city, for lack of a better term, appeared to be ancient beyond measure, its architecture following geometric principles that human mathematics couldn't adequately describe. Ground-penetrating radar data from orbital surveys conducted in secret after the X-74 mission showed a network of chambers and tunnels that honeycombed the entire far side of the moon. The scale was staggering, larger than any human city, with some individual chambers measuring several kilometers in diameter. But the most disturbing revelation was buried in the final pages of the report. The city wasn't abandoned. It was very much inhabited, and its residents had taken a keen interest in their human visitors. According to classified debriefing reports that Tom could barely believe were real, the X-74 crew had been in direct contact with the alien intelligences for their final 3 days on the lunar surface. The contact hadn't been through radio or any technology that humans understood. It had been direct mental communication, mind to mind across the vast gulf of evolutionary difference. Tom found Commander Hayes' personal debriefing report buried at the bottom of the file, written in the commander's own handwriting on official NASA letterhead. The document was labelled Eyes Only, Director Level, and bore Hayes' signature on every page. The beings we encountered are unlike anything in human experience or imagination, Hayes had written. They communicate through direct neural interface, bypassing the limitations of language entirely. Their thoughts are vast and ancient, but their message was unmistakably clear. We have trespassed in a place that was never meant for human presence. The report continued in Hayes' increasingly unsteady handwriting. They showed us visions of their city as it truly exists, not just the small portion visible on the surface, but a vast three-dimensional maze of structures and passages that extends deep into the lunar core. They've been there for millions of years, long before life on Earth evolved beyond the most primitive single-celled organisms. Hayes' handwriting became increasingly erratic as the report progressed. They are not malevolent in the way humans understand malevolence, but they are fiercely protective of their domain and their secrets. They allowed us to see their true forms, beings of living energy and crystallized light that can manipulate matter and space-time in ways that violate every law of physics we thought we understood. They could have destroyed us instantly, but instead they chose to study us, to learn about the species that had somehow developed the capability to reach their hidden sanctuary. The final paragraph was almost illegible, as if Hayes had been struggling to maintain control of his hand as he wrote. They are coming back with us. Not physically. Their forms cannot survive in Earth's environment any more than we could survive prolonged exposure to their realm without protection. But they have planted something in our minds, seeds of knowledge and awareness that will grow and spread through human civilization. They want to understand humanity completely, and they will use us as their windows into our world. God help us all. We have opened a door between worlds that can never be closed again. The report ended there, with Hayes' signature trailing off into an illegible scrawl. Tom set the papers down and stared at Mark, both men struggling to process the magnitude of what they had discovered. The astronauts came back, Tom said slowly, but they brought something with them. Mark nodded, producing yet another file. According to the classified medical reports I found, all 3 crew members exhibited unprecedented neurological symptoms after their return to Earth. They reported shared dreams of impossible complexity, spontaneous knowledge of scientific concepts they had never studied, and an inability to stop thinking about the lunar city and its inhabitants. What happened to them? They were kept in isolation at a classified medical facility for 8 months, undergoing constant medical and psychological evaluation. The doctors found changes in their brain structure that shouldn't have been possible, new neural pathways forming at impossible speeds, brain tissue that appeared to be partially crystalline in structure, and electrical activity patterns that resembled complex computer programs more than human thought. Mark paused, swallowing hard before continuing. Then, one by one, they died. Official cause, complications from radiation exposure during their extended lunar mission. Unofficial cause, according to the medical examiner's sealed report. He trailed off, shaking his head. What? Their brains had been fundamentally rewritten at the cellular level. The alien intelligences had been using them as living laboratories, studying human neurology from the inside out. The changes were so extensive that their basic biological functions began to fail, as their brains became something that was no longer entirely human. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The aliens were using them as test subjects, or as translators, Mark said quietly, learning everything they could about human physiology, psychology, and culture before their unwilling hosts died from the modifications. By the time the astronauts died, the aliens had downloaded decades worth of human knowledge and experience. The implications were staggering. An alien civilization with technology beyond human comprehension had spent months studying humanity through the minds of 3 unwilling subjects. They now possessed detailed knowledge of human society, government, technology, and psychology. For several minutes, both men sat in silence, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The office clock ticked loudly in the quiet, each second marking time in a universe that had suddenly become far more dangerous and mysterious than either of them had ever imagined. Finally, Tom spoke. "We have to go there. We have to see this city for ourselves." Mark looked at him as if he had completely lost his mind. "Tom, did you not just read what happened to the last people who went there? They were mentally invaded by alien intelligences and died horrible deaths, as their brains were systematically rewritten." "That was 50 years ago," Tom replied, though his voice lacked the conviction he was trying to project. "Technology has advanced exponentially since then. We understand more about radiation protection, about neural interfaces, about what?" Mark interrupted. "About beings that can rewrite human biology with a thought. About cities that exist partially outside our normal understanding of space and time. Tom, these aren't problems that can be solved with better equipment or improved training." But Tom's determination was unshakable. The discovery was too significant to ignore, too important to leave buried in forgotten files. This was first contact with an alien civilization, possibly the most important moment in human history. How could they possibly walk away from it? "Think about what we've learned," Tom said, leaning forward intensely. "An ancient alien civilization has been living beneath the lunar surface for millions of years. They've already studied humanity through the X-74 crew. They know we exist, they know where we live, and they have technology that makes our most advanced systems look like stone tools." Mark was shaking his head, but Tom continued. "If they wanted to harm us, don't you think they would have done it already? They've had 50 years to act on whatever they learned from Hayes and his crew. The fact that they haven't suggests that they're not immediately hostile. Or it suggests that they're planning something we can't even imagine," Mark countered. "Tom, we're talking about intelligences that are millions of years more advanced than us. We have no idea what their motivations or long-term plans might be." The debate continued for hours, stretching well into the early morning. Mark raised every reasonable objection he could think of, while Tom countered with arguments born of scientific curiosity and a lifetime spent wondering what secrets the stars might hold. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the office windows, Mark reluctantly agreed to help, not because he thought it was a good idea, but because he knew Tom would attempt the mission alone if necessary, and at least together they might have a slightly better chance of survival. The next 2 weeks were spent in careful planning and preparation. Using their security clearances and decades of accumulated favors within NASA's bureaucracy, they began assembling the resources needed for an unauthorized lunar mission. Tom remembered reading about an experimental deep space vehicle called the Endeavour that had been designed for extended lunar missions but never officially deployed due to budget constraints and shifting political priorities. The spacecraft had been mothballed in a forgotten hangar at Kennedy Space Center, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and misfiled paperwork. Getting access to the hangar required calling in favors from a dozen different technicians, engineers, and security personnel who owed Tom professional debts accumulated over his 22 years with the agency. Most of them didn't ask detailed questions about the mission parameters, assuming it was some kind of classified project that they weren't cleared to know about. The Endeavour was exactly what they needed, larger and more sophisticated than the Apollo-era lunar modules, designed for extended surface operations with advanced life support systems, enhanced radiation shielding, and communication equipment that was decades ahead of what the X-74 crew had available. Tom and Mark spent countless hours studying the classified reports, trying to understand what they might encounter on the lunar surface. They reviewed every photograph, analysed every frame of video, and memorised every detail of the alien city's visible architecture. They also spent considerable time preparing for the possibility that they might not return. Tom wrote detailed letters to his ex-wife and his elderly parents, explaining what he was doing and why he felt it was necessary. He sealed the letters in his apartment safe along with copies of all the classified documents they had discovered. The launch was as scheduled for a moonless night in late October, when orbital mechanics would place them on the most efficient trajectory to the lunar far side. The plan was simple: land near the X-74 site, investigate the alien city, document everything they could, and return to Earth with proof of humanity's first contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. As Tom suited up in the cramped preparation facility hidden beneath Kennedy Space Center, he tried not to think about the fact that he was about to follow in the footsteps of 3 men who had died horrible deaths as a result of their curiosity. The environmental suit was a marvel of modern engineering, far more advanced than anything available in 1974, with built-in medical monitoring, enhanced radiation protection, and communication systems designed to function even in high-interference environments. "Last chance to change your mind," Mark said over the comm system as they strapped themselves into the Endeavour's pilot seats. The spacecraft's interior was cramped but efficient, with every surface covered in switches, displays, and instruments that would guide them across the 250,000 miles of void between Earth and their destination. "No turning back now," Tom replied, though his hands were shaking as he ran through the pre-flight checklist. Part of him wondered if this was how the X-74 crew had felt during their final preparations, excited by the prospect of discovery but terrified by the implications of what they might find. The launch itself was surprisingly smooth, almost eerily so. The Endeavour lifted off from the secret launch pad without any of the typical complications or delays that plagued most NASA missions. As they broke through Earth's atmosphere and began their journey toward the moon, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that their mission was being facilitated by forces beyond their understanding. The 4-day transit to lunar orbit gave them time to review every piece of evidence they had gathered and to prepare, as much as anyone could prepare, for contact with an alien civilization. Tom studied the photographs and video logs until he had memorized every detail, while Mark focused on the technical aspects of their equipment and the scientific instruments they would use to document whatever they discovered. During the long hours of transit, as Earth slowly shrank to a pale blue dot behind them, Tom found himself thinking about the X-74 crew and what their final days must have been like. Hayes, Foster, and Wiles had been experienced astronauts, men trained to handle the unexpected and the dangerous. Yet something on the lunar surface had shaken them so completely that their final transmissions had been filled with terror. What could inspire such fear in trained professionals? What had they seen in that alien city that had driven them to the edge of sanity? As they approached the far side of the moon, Their instruments began to behave exactly as the classified reports had predicted. Radio communication with Earth became intermittent, then impossible, as some unknown force interfered with their transmissions. Navigation systems flickered and died one by one, forcing them to rely on visual landmarks and manual calculations to find their way to the Aitken Basin. "Tom," Mark said, his voice tight with concern, "we're experiencing the same interference that the X-74 crew reported. Our systems are being systematically compromised." Tom checked his own instruments and felt his stomach drop. Every electronic system on the Endeavour was showing signs of external influence, not random failures, but coordinated disruptions that suggested intelligent intervention. "Something knows we're coming," Tom said quietly. "Something's been tracking our approach since we entered lunar orbit." And then they saw it. As the Endeavour crested the rim of the Aitken Basin, the alien city spread out before them like a fever dream, made manifest. The classified photographs had shown only a tiny fraction of what actually existed on the lunar surface. The single spire that had so amazed the X-74 crew was indeed just one element of a vast architectural complex that stretched across the entire crater floor. The city was enormous, easily 20 kilometers across, and filled with structures that defied every principle of engineering and physics that Tom understood. Buildings rose from the lunar regolith like crystalline growths, their surfaces rippling with patterns of light that pulsed in slow, hypnotic rhythms. Some structures appeared to exist partially underground, with only their upper portions visible, while others soared impossibly high into the airless void above the lunar surface. The architecture followed no human aesthetic. The buildings seemed to grow organically from the moon's surface, their forms flowing and curving in ways that suggested they had been shaped by forces completely unlike those that created human cities. Some structures appeared to be composed of multiple intersecting geometric forms that hurt to contemplate for too long, while others seemed to phase in and out of visibility as if they existed only partially in normal space. The entire city hummed with energy that Tom could feel even through the Endeavour's heavily shielded hull. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, growing stronger as they descended towards the landing site. The sensation was both fascinating and deeply unsettling, like being in the presence of something vast and alien that was aware of his existence. "Jesus Christ," Mark whispered, staring out through the spacecraft's porthole. "How could orbital photography have missed something this massive?" Tom was wondering the same thing. The city was so large and so obviously artificial that it should have been visible to Earth-based telescopes, let alone the detailed orbital surveys that had been conducted since the 1960s. The only explanation was that the alien civilization possessed technology capable of hiding their presence from human observation. Technology that they had chosen not to use during the X-74 mission. They wanted the X-74 crew to find them, Tom realized, with growing unease. This entire city was deliberately revealed 50 years ago. The question is why? As they continued their descent, more details of the alien metropolis became visible. The spaces between the buildings weren't empty. They were filled with structures that seemed to move and shift, creating new configurations even as Tom watched. Gardens of crystalline formations grew in geometric patterns between the larger buildings, their faceted surfaces casting rainbow patterns across the surrounding architecture. And throughout the city, moving with fluid grace between the buildings, were figures that were clearly not human. The beings were tall and elegant, their forms seeming to shift between solid matter and pure energy as they moved. Even at a distance, it was obvious that these entities were the architects of the impossible city below. They moved with purpose and intelligence, occasionally pausing to observe the approaching human spacecraft with what appeared to be curious interest, rather than alarm. "They're not hiding from us," Mark observed, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and terror. "They want us to see them." Tom nodded, his mouth dry with fear and excitement. "The question is what they plan to do with us once we land." Their descent was no longer under their control. The Endeavour's engines had shut down without any input from Tom or Mark, yet their rate of descent remained perfectly controlled. Some external force had taken command of their spacecraft, guiding them towards a landing site that had clearly been prepared in advance. The landing zone was a flat area of lunar regolith at the edge of the alien city, surrounded by a ring of smaller crystalline structures that pulsed with welcoming light. As they touched down with impossible gentleness, far more smoothly than any human pilot could have achieved, Tom realized that every aspect of their arrival had been anticipated and controlled by their alien hosts. "We're not explorers," he said quietly, the full implications of their situation finally becoming clear. "We're invited guests." The dust settled around their spacecraft with dreamlike slowness in the low lunar gravity, revealing details of their surroundings that were both beautiful and terrifying. The nearest alien structures were only a few hundred meters away, their surfaces covered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow as Tom watched. The patterns were hypnotic, drawing his attention deeper and deeper until Mark shook his shoulder. "Don't stare at them too long," Mark warned. "I think they're designed to have some kind of psychological effect." Tom tore his gaze away from the mesmerizing patterns and focused on their immediate situation. Through the Endeavour's portholes, he could see that the alien beings had gathered to observe their arrival. Dozens of the tall, graceful figures stood at various distances from the landing site, their forms shimmering like mirages in the harsh lunar sunlight. "They've been waiting for us," Tom said, his voice filled with awe and terror. "All of this, the revealed city, the controlled landing, the welcoming committee, it was planned." Mark was checking their life support systems and environmental readings. "Our equipment is functioning normally now that we've landed. Whatever was interfering with our systems during descent seems to have stopped." Tom suited up first, his hands trembling, as he went through the familiar routine of sealing his helmet and checking his life support systems. The advanced environmental suit felt reassuring in a situation where nothing else made sense, but he knew that if the aliens wanted to harm them, no amount of human technology would provide protection. "Remember what happened to the X-74 crew?" Mark said as he prepared his own suit. "They started experiencing neurological symptoms within hours of first contact. We need to limit our exposure time and maintain constant communication with each other." "Agreed," Tom replied, though both men knew that if the aliens wanted to establish mental contact, there was probably nothing they could do to prevent it. They stepped out onto the lunar surface together, and immediately Tom felt the presence that the X-74 crew had described in their final transmissions. It was like being watched by a vast intelligence that was both alien and strangely familiar, as if something was studying them from just beyond the edge of perception. The sensation was overwhelming, not threatening exactly, but so powerful that Tom had to steady himself against the Endeavour's landing strut to keep from falling. It felt like standing in the presence of something ancient and vast, something that had been alive when the Earth was still a molten ball of rock and metal. The alien beings began to approach slowly, moving with the fluid grace that Tom had observed from orbit. Up close, they were even more extraordinary than the video logs had suggested. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, with bodies that seemed to be composed of living light contained within crystalline structures that suggested skeletal frames. Their forms were vaguely humanoid, but clearly evolved for an environment completely unlike Earth. When they moved, it was without any apparent effort, as if they were floating just above the lunar surface, rather than walking on it. Their limbs were long and graceful, ending in appendages that served as both hands and sensory organs. Most remarkably, they seemed to emit their own light, a soft, pulsing radiance that created beautiful patterns across their translucent skin. The first contact was not through sound or gesture, but through direct projection of images and emotions into Tom's mind. The experience was overwhelming, like having another consciousness suddenly merge with his own, sharing thoughts and memories that were completely alien, yet somehow comprehensible. Tom found his mind flooded with visions of the alien city as it truly existed, not just the portion visible on the surface, but a vast three-dimensional maze of chambers and passages that extended deep into the lunar core. He saw the beings in their natural environment, moving through halls filled with impossible geometries and technologies that made human science look like the fumbling attempts of children. But along with the wonder came a growing sense of unease. The aliens were studying Tom and Mark with the same clinical detachment that human scientists might show when examining laboratory specimens. They were not hostile, but they were utterly indifferent to human concepts of individual rights or personal autonomy. "Tom," Mark's voice crackled through the comm system, "something's happening to my suit readings. The atmospheric pressure sensors are fluctuating wildly." Tom looked over and saw that Mark's environmental indicators were indeed behaving erratically. The alien energy field surrounding them was interfering with their life support systems in subtle but potentially dangerous ways. "We need to get back to the lander," Tom said, but even as he spoke, he realized they were no longer free to make that choice. During their brief moment of contact with the alien minds, the city around them had changed. New structures had risen from the lunar regolith, effectively surrounding their landing site with a maze of crystalline walls that pulsed with hypnotic patterns of light. The Endeavour was still visible, but the path back to it was now blocked by barriers that definitely hadn't been there when they landed. "They're not letting us leave," Tom realized with growing horror. The alien beings projected another wave of images into their minds, and this time the message was unmistakably clear. The humans were welcome to explore the city, to learn its secrets and understand its purpose, but they would not be permitted to return to Earth with that knowledge. Tom understood now what had happened to the X-74 crew. They hadn't died from radiation exposure or equipment failure. They had been kept as permanent guests of the alien city, studied and analysed until their human biology could no longer sustain the modifications being made to their neural systems. "The city isn't just a place," Tom whispered into his comm system. "It's a collection system. It gathers intelligent species and preserves their knowledge and experiences." The crystalline walls around them continued to grow higher, and Tom could see more of the alien beings emerging from the buildings to observe their newest specimens. The entities moved with purpose now, no longer merely curious, but actively working to ensure that their visitors would remain permanently. Mark was struggling with his suit's environmental systems, which were being systematically compromised by the alien energy field. Tom tried to help him, but his own equipment was beginning to malfunction as well. The beings weren't trying to kill them. They were trying to modify them to make them more compatible with the city's alien environment. "We have to find a way out of here," Mark gasped, his breathing becoming laboured as his oxygen recycling system failed. But even as he spoke, both men realised the futility of their situation. The alien city had been preparing for their arrival for 50 years, ever since the X-74 mission had provided it with detailed information about human physiology and psychology. Every system failure, every equipment malfunction, every modification to their bodies was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to transform them into permanent residents of the lunar metropolis. Tom felt the alien thoughts beginning to intrude more deeply into his consciousness. Vast, ancient minds that had witnessed the birth and death of stars, that had travelled between galaxies and seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. The knowledge was intoxicating and terrifying, offering insights into the nature of reality that human science had never even imagined. But with the knowledge came the gradual erosion of his human identity. The alien minds were so fundamentally different from human thought that prolonged contact was like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. Tom could feel his memories, his personality, his very sense of self beginning to dissolve under the weight of alien experience. "Mark," he called out, but his colleague was no longer responding. Mark stood motionless, near one of the crystalline barriers, his helmet's visor reflecting the pulsing lights of the city as his consciousness was slowly absorbed into the vast collective intelligence that governed the lunar metropolis. Tom tried to run, but the alien city had become a maze designed specifically to prevent escape. Every path he chose led deeper into the heart of the metropolis, where the largest and most ancient structures waited to complete the process of transformation that had already begun. The crystalline walls around him pulsed with increasing intensity, and Tom realized that they weren't just barriers. They were processing centers designed to gradually convert human consciousness into something compatible with the alien collective. The patterns of light weren't random decorations. They were programs running on biological hardware that the aliens had been perfecting for millions of years. In his final moments of human consciousness, Tom understood the true horror of what they had discovered. The city wasn't just a monument to an ancient civilization. It was a cosmic trap, a collecting system that had been gathering intelligent species for eons. Every race that had ever achieved space travel and ventured to the moon's far side had been absorbed into the city's vast collective consciousness, their knowledge and experiences preserved forever, but their individual identities extinguished. The X-74 crew hadn't been the first human visitors to the lunar city. They had simply been the first to be officially recorded. For centuries, perhaps millennia, humans who had ventured too far from their home world had been drawn to the mysterious signals emanating from the moon's hidden side. Explorers, visionaries, dreamers, all had been collected and catalogued, their consciousness added to the alien repository of knowledge. As the alien minds completed their invasion of his consciousness, Tom's last coherent thought was a desperate hope that somehow, someone on Earth would realize what had happened and ensure that no other humans would suffer the same fate. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was hopeless. The city had learned everything it needed to know about humanity from its previous visitors. It understood human curiosity, human ambition, human inability to leave mysteries unsolved. More explorers would come, drawn by the same irresistible desire to understand the unknown that had motivated Tom and Mark and the X-74 crew before them. And the city would be waiting for them, patient and eternal, ready to add their knowledge and experiences to its ever-growing collection of absorbed civilizations. The lunar metropolis pulsed with satisfied energy as it welcomed its newest permanent residents. Deep within its crystalline structures, the remnants of human consciousness flickered briefly, before being integrated into something vast and inhuman and utterly alien. Tom Carter, the farm boy from Iowa who had dreamed of touching the stars, had finally achieved his goal. But the stars had touched him back, and the contact had transformed him into something that was no longer recognizably human. The city had been patient for millions of years, collecting specimens from across the galaxy. Now it had acquired detailed knowledge of Earth and its billions of potential subjects. The ancient intelligence that governed the lunar metropolis began to develop new plans, new strategies for expanding its collection. The moon continued its eternal orbit around Earth, its far side forever hidden from human observation, keeping its terrible secret safe from discovery. But the secret was no longer dormant. The ancient intelligence that ruled the alien city had learned much about humanity over the past century, and it was beginning to develop an interest in the blue world that hung in its sky like a ripe fruit waiting to be harvested. The trap had been fed again, but its appetite was far from satisfied. Soon, perhaps, it would be time to extend a more direct invitation to the rest of humanity, not to visit the lunar city, but to join it permanently in its timeless vigil among the stars. The battle for survival that Tom and Mark had fought was over. Before it truly began, the city had been planning their capture since the moment the X-74 crew had first made contact with its guardians 50 years earlier. Every action they had taken, every decision they had made, had been subtly influenced by alien intelligence working through channels that human consciousness couldn't perceive or resist. Now, the city possessed complete knowledge of Earth's location, its defenses, its population, and its potential for providing new specimens. The ancient collective that had been gathering intelligent life for millions of years was ready to expand its operations beyond the confines of the lunar far side. In the depths of the alien metropolis, where human consciousness had been absorbed and transformed into something unrecognizable, the entity that had once been Tom Carter experienced a final moment of clarity. The city was not content to wait for visitors any longer. It had learned enough about humanity to begin a more active collection process. Earth hung in the lunar sky like a blue jewel, unaware that it had been marked for harvest by intelligences older than human civilization. The moon, humanity's faithful companion for billions of years, had become a staging ground for an invasion that would be subtle, patient, and absolutely inevitable. The cosmic trap had been sprung, and now there was no escape for any of Earth's billions of inhabitants. They would all eventually become permanent residents of the alien city, their knowledge and experiences added to a collection that spanned galaxies and included the memories of countless extinct civilizations. The unknown had finally been touched, and it had reached back with hungry intent. The stars that had seemed so beautiful and distant from a cornfield in Iowa were revealed to be part of a vast web of intelligence that had been watching and waiting for humanity to develop the technology necessary to reach beyond their small world. Now that they had, the harvest could begin. The city pulsed with anticipation as it prepared to extend its influence beyond the lunar surface for the first time in millions of years. Earth would provide billions of new specimens, each one a unique perspective to be studied, catalogued, and absorbed into the eternal collective. The far side of the moon, hidden from human observation since the beginning of recorded history, would soon become the launching point for the final chapter in humanity's story. And when it was over, Earth would be empty, its population transformed into part of something vast and alien that had been gathering knowledge from across the cosmos since before the solar system was formed. The trap was complete, and humanity had walked into it willingly, driven by the same curiosity that had always defined their species. Now that curiosity would be their downfall, as they joined the countless other civilizations that had made the same fatal mistake of investigating the signals coming from the dark side of the moon. The ancient intelligence smiled with alien satisfaction as it began to plan the systematic collection of Earth's 6 billion inhabitants. The wait was finally over, and the harvest was about to begin.